Yeah, let's try it again. Good morning. There we are. All right. Appreciate your presence this morning and look forward to the day. It'll be a busy day. Been a busy weekend, and that's good. We've gotten acquainted and got to visit and get to know one another a little bit. I sure have enjoyed it. First Thessalonians 5 and verse 11 says, "Therefore encourage one another and build up one another as you have been doing." And that's a really good theme verse for what we're talking about this weekend because we're looking at this one another concept of what the church is all about. We think church, we think we are called out of the world, called into a relationship with God, and we think vertical. And we should. We think about the vertical relationship we have with God. But the vertical relationship we have with God is not the only relationship in this called out, called in. We also have a relationship with each other. We have horizontal relationships going on in which we enjoy this connection of fellowship one with the other. And that's why you have all of the one another's in the New Testament over and over and over again, some 50 plus times. And it all has to do with helping us understand how valuable this situation is, how valuable each of us are in this local fellowship setting we simply call the church. You know, it's paradoxical. In the same way that Jesus said, "You are more blessed if you give than receive." The paradox is that the giver actually becomes the receiver. That when you live like Jesus and you give, he says, "Blessed are," it's going to come back to you in different ways. And it's the same with what we're talking about this weekend. By encouraging others, by my encouraging you, guess what comes back to me? That's not a trick question. Mhm. Encouragement. I encourage you, but I get the same back. By serving you, I learn more about what it means to serve Jesus. By loving those within my fellowship and close connection with a spiritual relationship, I learn more about what God wants me to be and do. We talked on Friday night about love one another. That's the umbrella, that's the beginning place. And all of the other one another's flow out of that one. Love one another is the what to, all of the others are the how to. We talked yesterday morning about being members of one another. Each member of the physical body is important. Each member of the physical body has function. Well, it's the same thing spiritually as well. That's not hard to understand. We talked about being devoted to one another in brotherly love. That's familial, that's family. We get the family analogy. And so, if you're a Christian, you've been born again into this family of God, and God adds you to his family. And we become blood brothers and sisters, redeemed by the blood of Jesus. But I direct your attention this morning to Romans chapter 12 and verse 10. Romans chapter 12 and verse 10. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. That's what we talked about yesterday. But I want you to look at the second half of the verse. Give preference to one another. How? Your translation may say something different. I don't know. Give preference to one another. How? With what? Honor. But the New American Standard says, give preference to one another in honor. Hence, honor one another. What does that mean, and what does that look like in real time that we can understand? Let me ask you a question. You ever say about somebody else, I really like him because he lifts me up? I really like being around her because she is so encouraging. I'm going to guess there are times in which you have said that about somebody else. But the question is, do people say that about you? Do people say that about me? And if not, then maybe we need to kind of zoom in and take a closer look at Romans chapter 12 and verse 10. Give preference to one another in honor. All of us should strive to live like this. Romans 12 and verse 15 says, we rejoice with those who rejoice and we weep with those who weep. And so we rejoice with those who succeed. We rejoice with those who achieve. We rejoice with those who are honored. We're honored with them. Because after all, in this relationship called the church, we're not in competition. We work to complete one another. We work to help one another. We look past self to lift up others. And I think that's what he means when he says give preference to one another in honor. Now then, Jesus did this. And let me show you how he did this. Go back to Luke, the 14th chapter. Luke, the 14th chapter, beginning in verse 1. In Luke 14 and verse 1, the Holy Spirit pulls back the curtain. And we get to peek in through the window where Jesus is having a meal on a Sabbath, probably afternoon. And so in Luke chapter 14 and verse 1, it happened that when he, Jesus, went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Sabbath to eat bread, they, the Pharisees, they were watching him closely. So here's Jesus invited into the home of some of these Pharisees. In fact, he says the leader of the Pharisees. And it was occasion of grand hospitality, a Sabbath reception of very high standing among the Jewish inner circle of hierarchy. So this house is filled with all of these distinguished guests. But look at the end of verse 1. What were they doing? What does it say at the end of verse 1? What were they doing? Watching him closely. All eyes were on this 30-year-old carpenter, preacher, rabbi from Nazareth. And why were they watching him closely? Because the people were beginning to follow him. And the numbers were growing. In fact, the numbers of people following Jesus had become staggering. And Jesus has been diverting attention away from them, and they didn't like that. And the word on the street and the word from some of them were that he could work miracles that they could not deny. And beyond even that, he was making verbal public pronouncements against them, which they didn't like. And so there's jealousy going on, there's competition going on. And so verse 1 says, they were watching him closely. Here's the irony. He was watching them closely. Come down to verse 7. And he began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they were watching him closely. He's watching them just as closely. And he began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they had been picking out the places of honor at the table, saying to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this man. And then in disgrace, you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher, and then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. And here's his conclusion. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So, as they're watching Jesus carefully, he's watching them just as carefully. And he noticed how they picked their places to sit at this dinner. Because the Pharisees were noted for seeking preeminence, they loved recognition. And even as something as simple as choosing a place to sit at a meal apparently was a big deal. Undoubtedly, they wanted to have places where they sat that were important, perhaps at the head table. Humility was not exactly in their vocabulary, much less a part of their life. And Jesus is seeing all of this. I want you to hold your finger here in Luke 14 and just flip back for just a moment to Matthew 23. Jesus calls them out in Matthew 23 for the fact that they just, after notoriety all of the time. Matthew 23 and verses, oh, let's just choose verse 5, verse 6, verse 7. But they do all of their deeds. He's talking about these Jewish leaders. They do all of their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries. They had these things on their garments in which they would write Bible verses, and they would pray these things, and and they lengthen the tassels of their garments. They want everybody to notice them. They love the place of honor at the banquets. Now that takes us back to Luke 14. And the chief seats in the synagogues, and they want respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called by men rabbi. That's what they love. They love that notoriety, and they love to look down their noses at everybody else. A couple years ago, my wife was chosen to be chosen. Uh, any of you seen the movie The Chosen about the life of Jesus? And she was a part of the background extras in season 5. And season 5, which I think just came out just a few months ago, season 5 was the scene in the temple where Jesus is overturning the tables of the money changers and all of that kind of thing. And so it was out in, they filmed out in Utah, outside of Salt Lake City. And I was working with a small church in Idaho, and it worked out just great. I went and picked her up at the airport in Salt Lake, and we spent 3 or 4 days that week in actually Provo. And I would get up early every morning and I would take her out to join a friend of hers who was also in that season. And then they would carpool together to the location where they were doing all the filming. That wasn't my thing. I spent the week at Brigham Young University researching Mormonism. That was my thing that week. And so, but she went and did her thing. But it was really, really funny. Every morning I would drop her off about 5:30 in the morning at the hotel. And you go in this hotel and everybody's dressed in first century garb because all the extras are staying at these hotels. And so all these people look like they live in the first century. And as they're sitting there eating breakfast, they're all on their cell phones. It was the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. A bunch of first century people on their cell phones, or seeing them in their cars pulling out the parking lots, looking like they, just walked out of Jerusalem in the first century. But anyway, one day she came back. She said, I had the weirdest experience today. I said, what was it? She said, well, in the movie The Chosen, there's these couple guys that are really prominent Pharisees in the film, and they play their role really well. And so, we were doing our thing, moving, and so they broke. And there was a time when there wasn't anything going on. We were waiting for them to, do the action thing and start it all over again. And so she said, I just happened to be standing right next to these two guys. And she said, they're standing there with their arms crossed, obviously very much still in character. And she said, I looked up at them. Of course, you have to know my wife to understand this. She said, I just looked up at them and I said, where y'all from? And she said, they never broke character. They stood there with their arms crossed, looking like they were mad at the world. And they looked down at me like I was a dog. How dare I speak to them? And she said, suddenly I felt like I knew what it was like to be a woman in the first century. She said, they had total disdain for me. And they just stood there and they never broke character the whole time. And she said it was an awkward moment because I'm just standing there and they're not saying a word to me. And I thought, well, I better not say anything else to them. And so I just was waiting and waiting. And finally, when they got ready to start the filming again, she said one of the Pharisees broke character finally and leaned over and said, I'm from Mexico. But she said, suddenly I felt like what it would have been like to have been a woman back then and to be treated by these people who thought they were better than everybody else. So that's what we're dealing with here. And that's what Jesus is talking about in Luke chapter 14 when we get to see this scene. This is not a lesson on etiquette. He's not giving a lesson on banquet etiquette. That's not what this is. This is a lesson on humility. This is a lesson on learning how to self-empty so you can be lifted up in the eyes of God, not people. And so his conclusion in verse 11 is, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus said, humble yourself. And instead, why don't you exalt others? Why don't you lift up others around you? In the words of Paul, why don't you give preference to one another in honor? So Jesus preached this principle. But Jesus, secondly, practiced this principle. In the same message of Luke, but this time in chapter 19, Jesus and his disciples walk into the city of Jericho. And you're very familiar with this scene in Luke chapter 19. He entered Jericho, was passing through, and there was a man called by the name Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was and was unable because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said, this is where I shift into vacation Bible school mode. He looked up and said, Zacchaeus, you come down from there because I'm going to your house today. You know the song. Okay. So he hurried and came down and received him gladly. When again, now we're going to go back to Jewish leadership. When they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, he has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. If I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. Jesus said, today salvation has come to your house because he too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which is lost. So here comes Jesus and his disciples, and they're coming through Jericho. And perhaps later in the day. And so it's obvious they're going to have to take some kind of rest. And the scuttlebutt is, where's Jesus going to go? Where's Jesus going to find the place of rest? Whose home is he going to go to? Certainly he would probably go to the home of one of the Jewish leaders, the VIPs and all that kind of deal. Where will the master stay? And the irony of ironies is, Jesus attaches honor to someone who didn't have it. He attaches honor to this man, Zacchaeus, who was not just a tax collector, but a chief tax collector. Tax collectors were Jews working for the hated Romans because this was occupied. This was an occupied time. And so the tax collectors were looked at as scum, as a traitor. And many of them were dishonest. And so when Jesus looks at Zacchaeus and says, I'm going to your house, look at verse 7, the response that he gets from the Jewish leadership. They began to grumble, saying he is gone to be the guest of a sinner. So I guess the question is, why did Jesus do it? Of all the places Jesus could have stayed in Jericho, why with Zacchaeus? And I think the answer is because Jesus could read his heart. And so Jesus chose one who in his heart felt totally undeserving. And so Jesus gave honor to someone who felt like he deserved none. But didn't Jesus do that over and over and over again? Did he not do that to the woman at the well? I do a whole lesson sometimes on Jesus and this conversation with the woman at the well. It is so fascinating to me. By the way, it is the longest one-on-one conversation recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John to this unnamed woman at the well. And the other thing that fascinates about me, about the situation there is because when it's the first time Jesus announces that he's Messiah. He announces that I am Messiah to an unnamed woman in the middle of nowhere in a well. But he's always doing that. To the Bethesda beggar, he reached to him. To the thief on the cross, to the 12. Remember the 12 in John 13 in the upper room? Remember that? As they're all gathered that evening to observe the Passover in the upper room, John 13 and verse 4 tells us that in the midst of this gathering, Jesus gets up from supper, lays aside his garments, he takes a towel and he girds himself, and he takes a basin of water and he begins moving from man to man to man. I'm going to surmise that at first nobody noticed. I don't think Jesus makes a flashy announcement here. I don't think Jesus rose from supper and said, okay, man, may I have your attention? I'm going to show you what it means to serve others. I don't see that. I think Jesus quietly gets up from supper, girds himself with a towel, gets a basin of water, and slowly moves from man to man to man. We don't understand. We don't get the washing of the feet thing because our roads are paved, you know, and we're not walking around most of the time in sandals on dirt roads and all that kind of deal. But back then it was different. In the dry and hot season of summer, everybody's feet's going to be dusty and dirty. During the rainy season, everybody's feet's going to be muddy. And so when somebody comes into your home or something, they come into a place, the greatest act of humility would be to, let me wash your feet. For one thing, you don't want them tracking all over your house, do you? Huh? I was at Mike and Andrea's house. I love the sign she has when you walk in the door. Would you kindly remove your shoes or something like that? I love the word kindly. They have interesting signs around their house. On their gate and their driveway, it says, beware of, just beware. That's what it says. Beware of, just beware. I don't get that except Mike. That's a Mike thing, right? Okay. So kindly, I love that. And back then it was a necessity. It was absolutely a necessity. And it was a menial task. And so here's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords girding himself with a towel and washing their feet. Why? Well, they had dirty feet, but it was more than that. Hold your finger here. Back in Luke 22, Luke kind of gives us a little insight as to where all of this came from. Luke 22, verse 14. When the hour had come, he reclined at table and the apostles with him. So, Last Supper, that's what we're talking about. So, you come on down to verse 24. All right, now we get to eavesdrop on the conversation. Jesus is in the upper room with his men. They're all talking. They're a bunch of men. They're all talking at once. Loud conversation. And what were they talking about? Verse 24. There arose a dispute among them as to which one of them was the greatest. Interesting. Jesus is sitting here listening to a discussion of these men about who's the greatest. And in the middle of all of this boisterous, manly kind of thing, Jesus gets up. Rather nonchalantly, I think, gets a towel, pours water into a basin, and he kneels down at that first man. He starts to wash his feet. I wasn't there, you weren't there, but I'm going to guess, human beings being who we are, I'm going to guess that slowly the noise volume in the room decreased. As they begin to see what Jesus is doing, all of a sudden their loud, boisterous conversations about who's the greatest got very quiet. And Jesus made a lasting impact upon these men that they would never forget. They were too busy looking for thrones. They weren't interested in a towel. They were too busy fighting for position, jockeying for position. Remember the mother of James and John? She had already come to Jesus and said, "Oh, these are my boys." And of course, she's proud of her boys. I get that. But she said, could one sit on your right and the left? And that really created a rift among the other 10. And so Jesus is presenting a tremendous lesson here in John chapter 13. But focus in on verse 17 when it was all said and done. John 13 and verse 17, where Jesus drives home the point. And he says this, he says, if you know these things, you are blessed if you what? If you get together on a Wednesday night and have a Bible study and talk about it. Is that what he says? Is that the blessing? Where's the blessing? Do it. You know these things, but you're going to be only blessed if you do these things. Honoring is about doing. Honoring is about serving. When Peter, years later, 1 Peter 5 and verse 5 says, he said, clothe yourself with humility toward one another. I wonder when he wrote that, did his mind go back to the scene of that upper room and Jesus on his knees washing the feet of all of those men, including himself? Point is, all of us are servants. None of us are lords. Grab a towel. Take a towel. There's plenty of work to be done. So Jesus preached this principle. Jesus practiced this principle. And the Apostle Paul applied it in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5, 6, 7, and 8. He said, here it is. Have this attitude in you, which was in Christ, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Paul says, let me remind you about Jesus. Before you get lifted up in pride and think it's all about you, think about Jesus. Humility, sacrifice. And the result is in verse 9, he says, for this reason, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. The point is, the irony of Christianity is that if you want to be honored by God, serve one another. If you want to be a leader, whether it's a leader in the home, a leader in the church, if you want to be a leader, step down to serve. I do a lesson sometimes on leadership in the church. It's called Step Up to Step Down. We step up to lead, we step down in so doing to serve like Jesus did. The best there's 4 books on leadership. They're the best books on leadership ever written. You know what they are? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You want to learn about being a leader? Look at Jesus. So Paul says in verse 3 and verse 4 of chapter 2 in Philippians, he says, so here it is, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourself. Do not merely look out for your interests, but for the interest of others. All right, let me leave you with 4 things. 4 things that we can do to make this work practically. So if you got something to write with, let me give you 4 things to kind of leave you with these thoughts. There'd be 40 things. You don't have time. Let me just give you 4 things we can do. Jesus said, you are blessed if you do the. All right, what can we do to serve? All right, number 1, I can give of myself. I can give of myself without expecting anything in return. Somebody said one time, the stature of a man is measured by his friendliness and by his courtesy towards someone who can do absolutely nothing for him. And that's Bible. Acts 20:35. It is more blessed to give than to receive. And the stature of a man in the sight of God is defined in terms of giving. And what was it Jesus said? To the extent that you did it to one of the least of these, you have done it unto me. So if I want to honor him, if I want to honor Jesus, I'm going to honor you. I'm going to honor my brother. I'm going to honor my sister. I'm going to do everything I can to lift you up. That's what it's all about. Secondly, go out of your way, AKA the extra mile, to help. Go out of your way to help. Romans 12 and verse 13 says, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality. There's something I think we need to explore a little bit more, is really what is inherent in the idea of hospitality. Is hospitality something that I engage in when it's convenient for me? Is that what it's all about? Is hospitality something I engage in when I've got everything just perfect and just right, and I see visions of Martha Stewart dancing in my head? Is that what hospitality is? That's not what hospitality is. My grandmother was in her early 90s, and I mean, for years, every Sunday night, she would have all the young people to her home. It was an open door invitation every Sunday night. All the young people from church could have a place to go. They could come to her house. The deal was they had to bring pizza, but they could warm it up in her oven and whatever. But her house was open, and she's in her early 90s. And I said to her one day, I said, Nana, I said, why don't you hang out with people your own age? She said, son, people my age are in the cemetery. She said, I like hanging out with these kids. It's great, you know? And I love that. I absolutely. I was in a meeting in College Station, Texas, where Texas A&M is. You have to understand, Texas A&M is a city. They have 60. Listen, they have 60,000 students. I mean, it's a huge place. And the church there where I was had about 120 students from Texas A&M coming and attending and that sort of thing, and great atmosphere. Um, and so I got there, and the meal list is, people sign up. They want to feed the preacher, all that kind of deal. And so I'm going out to some really nice homes and really fancy places and all this kind of thing. And then one night, there was a young college, newly married couple. They had signed the meal list. And I get to their home, and it's just a little bitty house they were renting. And the only vehicle they had was a motorcycle that they shared back and forth. And the little table in the kitchen was, you could barely get 3 people in there. And I thought to myself, of all of the people in this congregation who would get a pass and nobody would think a thing, would have been this young college couple. And years later, when I think about that week, all of the other places I went, it's kind of a blur, but that sticks in my mind to this day. Because those kids did what wasn't even expected of them, but they did it anyway. They understood the principle of serving. They understood the principle of going out of their way to help. I love that. Number 3, pay compliments generously. I know this is basic, but pay compliments just generously. There's not anything that honors your brother or sister more than when you notice them. Sometimes we can become so entitled in our culture that we forget the very basics of humanity, like the words thank you, or I just want you to know I appreciate you, or you're an encouragement to me. I'm not talking about flattery. Flattery is wrong. Flattery always has a hidden agenda. Flattery, really, if you peel back the layers, is about self promotion. I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back. That's not what this is. This is genuine. This is sincere. This is heartfelt. This is Christ kindness. And sometimes we forget to be kind. So pay compliments generously. And number 4, this is so important. Listen to others. Listen to others. Tune in to them. One of the things I learned about Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all of these conversations he had all these one-on-one conversations. You understand the most important person in the world of Jesus was the person to whom he was speaking at the time? He focused on that individual. Whether it was the woman at the well, whether it was the children who were coming to him, the scripture says he took them up in his arms. Zacchaeus. Here was Jesus ministering to thousands, but he focused on the people who came to him with whom he had conversation one at a time. When you talk to someone, make them feel important because you're listening, because they are important. Someone asked me one time, the secret to preaching. What's the secret of preaching? There's no secret. It's love people. Love people. So what have we said? Give of yourself, go out of your way to help, be generous with your compliments, and listen to others. And I'll tell you what will happen if you do that. One of these days, somebody's going to say, I really like being around him. I love being around her. You know why? Because of all of these things. And lo and behold, the person they're talking about is you. Give preference to one another in honor. Did I hear a bell? What? Oh, I'm done. That's the 5-minute warning. It's like NFL 2-minute warning. I love ball games like football games where I'll say, honey, there's only 2 minutes left in the game. She said, it's going to take 45 minutes to play those 2 minutes. I'm done. Y'all visit. Enjoy.